You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now it's time to Go Commando.
Hey Commandos, we've got an awesome show for you today. Gentlemen that I've known for now almost 20 years. We met back in 1999. We were both Marine Corps officers overseas, and that's where we first met. So we're going to get into his background. He has spent a considerable amount of time both enlisted and as an officer in Force Reconnaissance, Marine Special Operations, and even served at the Special Operations Command. He was deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, seen combat. Incredible veteran. We've got a great show for you. And before we get started, I want to talk to you about some products which help us bring you the best shows. So I'm down here in Tampa where he's retired, and this great polo shirt, this Go Commando shirt, you can get your Commando shirt through the website. Just go to gocommandoShow.com/shop and go shop for whatever you want. Short sleeve shirt, workout shirt, polo shirt, even ones for the ladies. We also have this silver bullet. So if you're down here in Tampa and you're sweating, get yourself the silver bullet. It's great for keeping hot things hot, cold things cold. It's got the pop top so that you can pour it into the little top and drink it. And great product. And then coming into Brad's house today, we had a Commando confession. I saw that he had an Amazon box right there from his garage leading into the house. That's a no-go. Make sure if you're ordering Amazon, you go to the gocommandoShow.com. It doesn't capture your email. I don't want any of that kind of stuff. But order through the website, and Amazon helps reimburse us for the show. It goes directly to your Prime account, and like you never even seen it. You're shopping through Amazon. You're guaranteed to get the greatest price. Do not worry about, if there is some kind of. I put everything on the web, so nobody's going to steal your information by putting something on the web or to secretly capture that. That is all done through me, not through a third party. So you listen to Justin Carroll, Marine Raider, and you listen to Mr. New from On-Site Logic tell you about security issues. Make sure you're secure, but the Go Commando Show website is done entirely by myself. You do not have to worry about your information being compromised. But if you do shop through Amazon, Entirely Pets, any of our athletic products, do it through the Go Commando Show, and you're supporting this show. So welcome to the show, Brad. We're glad that you're here, and we want to get into, because you joined the Marine Corps while you were very young, and you served as early as you could, as you enlisted in the Marine Corps as Reconnaissance Marine. So how old were you when you first decided, and what were those events like that led you to want to join the Marine Corps?
So Fred, there were a number of, several members of my family had been Marines. My father, my uncle, my grandfather had served in World War II. So I knew pretty much at an early age that I wanted to enlist in the Marine Corps. Outside of that, my father had been in the Marines and then had transitioned over to the 101st Airborne Division. So he went to the Army. So I knew fairly early that I wanted to be a Marine, but also wanted to jump out of airplanes. And I think literally that set the groundwork for, for the future.
Then when you got in the Marines, you got into Force Reconnaissance really early. And we both served in Force Reconnaissance a number of years. That's one thing that, there is no end of training in Force Reconnaissance. It's one where you have a lot of initial school phase, some 6 months, and some go for a whole year of pipeline training. And then after that, you have to continuously do unit training. Then you go to secondary schools for sniping, jump master. Talk a little bit about those experiences for yourself as far as being a young Marine and some of these schools, like you said, you wanted to jump out of planes. What was that initial phase like as a young Force Reconnaissance enlisted Marine?
So in 1992, I actually had the opportunity to go through, after going through, getting selected, was going through amphibious reconnaissance school in Little Creek, Virginia. Provided a tremendous opportunity. I think some of the biggest things that really shaped a lot of my initial thoughts and perspectives on training. The staff NCOs had a tremendous amount of influence on that. And it really impressed me because that was my initial impression with the reconnaissance community in the beginning and how I saw things and really shaped things towards the future. So a lot of the baseline skills of patrolling, amphibious reconnaissance, the amount of discipline and all the things that are not usually quantified that go into development, that really set the pace for a lot of things.
And a lot of folks, they typically think of Force Reconnaissance and they think of Marine Special Operations. They think of some things high speed. Can you talk about one of those moments that everybody thinks is high speed, cool, super sexy, but when you're actually doing it, it could be the opposite? Can you talk about any of those memories that you have for yourself?
Yeah, well, I would say, it's kind of hard to flash back on a lot of things, but I think the biggest thing is looking at, helocasting. I think helocasting is one of those things. It's a modified technique. It provides a great insert capability and platform. Soft duck. I mean, those are things that are great opportunities and provides scalability and options, but is not as that big of a deal as it seemed to be. So,
and for those listeners that are not familiar with that terminology, so helocasting, what that is when we want to insert a reconnaissance team. Oftentimes, we're coming off of a ship and we're trying to get to an objective on shore. So we'll take a helicopter and go off the coast and have that reconnaissance team. We'll slow that helicopter down to about 10 knots and about 10 feet above the water, and it's often at night. And then the team will jump in from the helicopter into the ocean and then fin in with their equipment. And the soft duck, which you also mentioned, is when you pretty much do the same, but you're tossing out of the helicopter a Zodiac, a small rubber inflatable boat out the back of the helicopter, and then you jump in into the water and you get into the boat and take the boat in. And if you're going offshore much further than you would normally fin in from. So those are things that everybody always usually thinks are just fun and easy, but it does take a lot of time and preparation, and there's a lot of risk involved. A lot of times we've had helicopters that don't project the right altitude. The Marine Corps, old Marine Corps helicopters they don't have any Doppler radar, so sometimes they get a little too close to the water, and those have gone really bad. But other thing too, Brad, is you've been to a lot of schools in the Marine Corps as a young reconnaissance Marine. I know you've been to Ranger School. What is probably the moment in the Marine Corps that you're most proud of when you were a young enlisted Marine? That whether it's a school or some training, you think of one of those times that stands out to you the most?
I think there was a couple. I think one, you mentioned Ranger School. For the Marine Corps, it's for a young Marine to go. It's a unique opportunity for enlisted Marine. I had to get a waiver to go because I was too young at the time to be able to. Usually, it was an NCO or above. They focus a lot on leadership, adversity. You've got essentially during that time period, it was 4 phases where you're focusing on little sleep, little food, and basically being able to accomplish missions. So I think as far as the basics on doing a lot of the proper things as far as patrolling, planning, and leadership of men, the Army does a pretty good job on being able to work that course. They take a lot of pride in it. I will tell you the graduation rate was pretty selective. The course that I went through in 993 was less than 15%. So it's good. It's a great experience. I enjoyed it. You're able to do, you're pretty much focused the entire time for 2.5 months. So I enjoyed it. It was a great opportunity, good leadership.
And you went to several of these courses, but then you also did unit level training, and it continues to build and grow both your individual skills, your collective skills as a team and as a platoon. But then also, as like everything, not in everybody's career, but in your career in particular, it continues to advance. And that one of those moments was when you decided, hey, I'd like to become a Marine Corps commissioned officer. And not everybody that enlists goes that route, but that is significant change in responsibilities. And what was the first thing that led you to want to become a Marine Corps officer when you were enlisted Marine? You were sergeant, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So to me, being a Force Recon Marine provided a tremendous opportunity. It provided a lot of challenge to be able to prove for myself, develop great friendships that have lasted over 25 years, and really set the foundations for a lot of the educational and professional experiences that I've had after that. So essentially, I was a corporal. I had my commanding officer and a captain came and pulled me aside, pulled me in the office, and basically said, "Hey, we are going to recommend you for OCS." I wasn't very excited about that at the time. I had a lot of great friendships. I'd spent a lot of time with the guys that were my team, and we had worked together and been together for several years. I wasn't overly excited about it. But as soon as I walked out of there, company First Sergeant Williams, grabbed me and basically pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you really need to think about this." And I told him I would, and I did. So about a week later, I came back and circled back with him and said, "Hey, I'll do it." And best decision ever made.
Yes. Now, it's a big difference, big change, because especially in your case, you later on went back into the reconnaissance field after getting your commission. But the training for an officer, because we both had gone into the infantry, it's about a year-long phase from when you're talking officer candidate school, like you mentioned, OCS. Then after that, you get a commission, and then you move on to the basic officer course. So that's 6 more months, and then there's an infantry officer course, which is approximately 3 months. So you're spending about a year, and often much of it is leadership and field training, not so much the special skills, but it's like the name of the course, the basic officer course. But it's a chance for you to show leadership, because you're working around a lot of people which are primarily straight out of college. They don't have that military experience. And how did you feel your prior enlisted experience, especially in reconnaissance, set you up in comparison to your peers? And how was that year-long training with your background being in Force Recon?
So what I would tell you is that my previous experience absolutely prepared me for that. I think a lot of it was a lot of the independent thought, a lot of the initiative that is required to be a reconnaissance Marine helped shape those decisions. Obviously, with the physical and mental challenges that evolve into that, I was absolutely more than prepared to transition to become an officer. Actually during that, through OCS, I ended up being selected for the OCS honor grad for leadership. So, here again, it's a school. It's a short snapshot in time, but I think all the preparation that had gone to that point, I was more than prepared and excited for the opportunity to lead Marines.
And what was the biggest difference when you got out into the operational forces between when you were younger as an enlisted Marine? You were doing a very serious job in a force reconnaissance team, but now as an officer, you're checking out into the operational forces. Once you've completed all the basic training, you got 42 Marines and a corpsman, a total with yourself, 43 men out there in 29 palms, you're doing live fire. What was some of the big moments and big changes in responsibility in your leadership as an officer?
So what I would tell you is the biggest thing was friendships. I had a lot of Marines that other enlisted Marines that I had been through some very challenging and tremendous opportunities with. I had been told that, hey, things are different now, and they were. However, I believe what I could utilize was taking my experience that I had as an enlisted Force Recon Marine, taking that and using that with the education and experience that I'd gained as becoming an officer to be able to utilize that and come up with common sense solutions.
Now, for the commandos out there, he's talking about a unique experience, which we both had, of being enlisted Marines that we transitioned, earlier on in our careers to becoming an officer. Those of you listening, you may be, working in a factory farm, and now it's that time for you to assume that leadership, like Brad Carr was mentioning here. It's very, very important that there's two things that have to happen. One, you have to mentally transition that I have to keep things going. I have to be thinking at a higher level with vision long term, and those responsibilities, because the weight's more so on your shoulders to do everything to accomplish those jobs, no matter what your job may be. And then two, it may seem fun that you've been promoted and you still can be one of the boys down in the at the frontline foot soldier, but you have to make sure that they understand that when decisions are made, that you're in charge. And so many people forget that. They think that it's that they're just one of the guys still, even though they've been promoted, even though they're in charge. You can't ever let that get down to where it's, we're all still pals and everything. So when you were an officer, Brad, when did you realize, as a young infantry officer, rifle platoon commander out in 29 Palms, when did you realize that, hey, I really do want to get back to some of what you did as an enlisted Marine, and specifically in the force reconnaissance field? What was that moment like for you, and when did you realize it?
So really, I realized it before I was commissioned. I knew once I'd made the decision that I wanted to become an officer, that I wanted to go back and go through selection again, to actually go back and become a Force Recon Marine officer. This was my entire goal with being in the Marines. It was to stay with Force as long as possible. And for me, there was no better place to be.
And, what Brad mentioned there, specifically said as long as possible. The typical career path for an infantry officer at that time period when we were young was they would do normally 1 or 2 overseas deployments. It was an exception for somebody to do 2. And he did 2 of them, which only a small percentage, about 8 or 9 lieutenants out of an entire battalion of infantry officers that get selected to go out for a second one. And he didn't do that in a role as like a company executive officer. He remained as a platoon commander over weapons, an 81 millimeter mortars platoon. So still maintained that tactical, but in a very critical role. And then, continued to remain in the operational forces by going over to Force Recon. And that's the next question I wanted to ask, Brad, is I know we crossed our paths when we were over in Okinawa, and on both of your deployments overseas. And this, for the listeners, before the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had even started, Okinawa was kind of like the edge of the empire. That was the place you'd go. That was the most forward deployed you would be as a Marine. You're living on this small island, and from there, you're shooting out to do all these incredible training evolutions from Korea to the Philippines, Brunei, Australia, you name it. You're going all over the place, and it's much different being forward in a place that's deployed and going to these exercises than it is if you're in North Carolina or in California as a Force Recon Marine. And so, and you knew that because you and I had both been stationed in California. And what led you to want to serve? I mean, you saw Force Recon units on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and then when you were deployed, you saw them in Okinawa. What led you to select, hey, I want to go to Okinawa versus one of the stateside Force Recon units?
So my experience of traveling and training with foreign militaries throughout the Far East was fantastic. I wanted to have the opportunity to do it again as a Force Recon Marine officer. To me, there was nothing more exciting than having the independence, commander's intent, minimal guidance, and essentially the essence of message to Garcia and go figure it out. During this time, Okinawa was the edge of the empire. From deploying and training from mainland Japan, Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Australia, and several more other countries. These were great experiences. You had the ability to go out there and work on skills and capabilities that you knew that needed to be developed, and you had the freedom to do that. So to me, that was very, very exciting, and it was a great opportunity. So I really I relished that.
And what Brad's talking about, he had, his time in the Marine Corps is much like mine. It's opposite of a lot of officers. You start out with a 43-man platoon, and as you get promoted, you're usually in charge as an infantry officer, in charge of more. But in both our cases, we went to Force Recon, and you're in charge. You go from 43 down to 25. But it does. I mean, these are, the elite Marines of the Marine Corps. Basically, the NFL Super Bowl team, and because of the smaller size and the highly trained skills, those are skills and units that other countries want to get involved in across the Pacific Rim, and that's an excellent opportunity. And Brad, did you feel that some of those skills and those deployments, you're compared to a lot of your peers, some of them went off. The normal career for an officer at that point is going to like recruiting, the drill field, something outside of the operational forces. And how would you say your experiences were compared to a lot of your peers that transitioned, and now you stayed over there in Okinawa for 3 years? How would you say your experience leading troops going to country was compared to the average guy that PCS'd out of an infantry battalion and he's sitting in a recruiting station or something?
I would say the big thing is really it comes down to is choice and opportunity. To me, I joined the Marine Corps. I wanted to deploy. I wanted to go places. I wanted to go to combat. I wanted to do the things that people read about. Those are the types of things that I wanted to have the opportunity to do. So to me, that was the relishment of the excitement of doing that. To me, there's requirements and there's needs for recruiters. There's needs for the recruit depots. There's people and places to do that. That was just not something that I was interested in, nor did I ever want to do. So I actively pursued every opportunity to deploy and lead Marines.
And did your leadership change significantly? And if so, how? When you were a 81s millimeter platoon commander out there in 29 Palms, constantly firing a lot of mortars and supporting courses, and then all of a sudden you go back to the Force Recon community, you're a captain, you're in charge of a Force Recon platoon that's, going to different countries, that's briefing a full bird colonel as his eyes and ears and his direct action tactical component to get into an area, do something that's, when he wants to minimize collateral damage, it must be precise, it's high risk. You are the person on the spot. So how did your leadership role change from being a platoon commander in the infantry to a platoon commander working from either, you're supporting a colonel on the MU, and you're really, Force Recon is called Force because it supports a Marine Expeditionary Force. It's not that we're forced to do the job, but a Marine Expeditionary Force commanding general is a 3-star commander, and that's who we're providing that information for. So how did you change as a young captain? Now your briefing is, the strong hammer for a full bird colonel, a tactical operational unit deployed on a ship, or ultimately for the 3-star general. How big of a change was that for you?
So I would say my leadership style, I think it changes. I think absolutely. I think as a leader, you mature and grow based upon time and experience. I love my time with the infantry, but when the infantry battalion gets released and they get, they open the gates of hell, they're going to fuck stuff up. And that's what they're designed to do. And they're very good at it. The force reconnaissance, when a platoon comes in, you've got different levels of expectation and you've got different mission requirements. So it's a mallet versus a scalpel. Sometimes you need a little finesse depending upon what the task was. So I think it absolutely changes. I think you're, a lot of the high risk events that you're doing, a lot of the insert skills take more maturity. They take more experience to be able to do a lot of these things. And also you've got to find balance. I think, being able to find that balance and, what's important at the time, because you'll have multiple priorities where, you've got a lot of things going on, but you've just got to prioritize based upon time.
And what were some of the most, you were stationed overseas as a Force Recon Platoon Commander for 3 years. It's a very long time to stay operational, even after your first operational tour. So you've gained a lot of experience from your enlisted tour, then you move over to become an officer. You do 2 deployments where most officers just do 1, and now you're in Force Recon overseas. You're deploying to a lot of countries. You deployed on a ship as the colonel's, go-to force for, very tricky and sensitive missions. And then you became the Force Recon Company Commander for a period of time. What were some of the most memorable experiences you had from your time in Force Recon in Okinawa?
I think the biggest thing to me was the ability of being, having the sensation of alone and unafraid, of being able to go out and do a lot of these, the mission requirements. I think with the Muse, to me, that was a fantastic opportunity. One quick story. I remember the MU commander pulled me in the office and basically said, "Hey, I'd like to have your, what do you think you need to work on, or what would you like to do?" And I told him submarine operations, and he kind of looked at me, and he said, "Hey, do you have your SOPs?" And I chuckled because I'd been working on them for months. And essentially I walked back into his office 5 minutes later, dropped off 2 big notebooks filled of SOPs, opened up the chapter on submarine operations, and said, "Yes, sir, I do. They're right here." So from then on, he never questioned me about any SOPs or anything else. We were able to do submarine operations. It was a unique experience. So to me, that was one. I think, the things that really stand out to me are the Marines and the corpsmen that we had the ability to work with, are guys that I will remember forever. I think having that opportunity to, stand on the back of a C-130 at night, full combat equipment, being able to lead your platoon out, to me, that was always the most exciting. So.
You talk about a lot of those unique moments. To put it in reference for the listeners who've never been to Okinawa, Japan, this is an island about 900 miles south of Tokyo off mainland Japan. Warm most year round, quite tropical, but it's very isolated. And of the 12 different American bases that are on Okinawa, Camp Schwab is, a base, one of the most northern bases. At the time, it was all male and very isolated. So it's a big difference between, where we had previously been stationed in California. Brad's unit with the 7th Marine Regiment stationed out in 29 Palms, which is very isolated. But now you're talking, you can get wives and girlfriends, and your family can come visit to sunny California. They can come out to 29 Palms, or you can go to Disneyland in Orange County, but your family really can't come out to Okinawa, Japan. That's a whole different ballgame. So, my question, Brad, is you got a lot of experience in leading Marines, but how were your experiences when you were in Okinawa and those Marines that were over in Okinawa with you? There was a different caliber guy because there's no real big liberty to be had. liberty meaning off time to, some guys were able to find girlfriends, but there was, not getting into economics class, but you talk about scarcity. That's that was an item that just didn't exist over there. But the Marines really could focus on a couple of things, and that was work, physical fitness. Some people really got into their faith. Some people got into drinking, but one of those four things. And what were your experiences, Brad, when compared to your Marines in California to the Marines that you led in Okinawa when you were there in Force Recon?
So the biggest difference I would say would be focus. I think that was a tremendous thing. I think with being in remote locations, you don't have the ability for distractions. There's a lot of time where essentially you're PTing and training, and that's pretty much driving your agenda on a lot of things that you're doing. So you do become very, focused on those events to be able to prepare yourself and your unit for combat. But to me, that was the biggest things. 7th Marine Regiment was fantastic. I enjoyed my time there. I don't think we ever shot a blank ever. We had more ammunition and training opportunities and more flexibility. Here again, a rifle platoon, an infantry rifle platoon, as a platoon leader. Platoon commander was fantastic. And then moving over to be an 81's platoon commander, with having, 72 Marines and sailors, was pretty fantastic. But, here again, it's a different skill. Sometimes you need the mallet and scalpel. So,
and one of the things, Brad and I both served in reconnaissance and special operations units on both coasts, as well as in Okinawa. And he talks about focus, and you're not having a lot of alternatives to do in Okinawa, and compared to the units based in the United States that we've both been assigned to, they were close to the ocean. And in Force Reconnaissance, one of the bread and butter missions is that amphibious reconnaissance, coming from, a ship at night, and you're coming across that beach and coming in there where, the beauty of in Okinawa, Japan is your amphibious reconnaissance skills. I mean, you're literally on a point, a geographic point where, the boat locker and the dive locker are on the water. You're only a few steps away. And the other units, they had those resources, but, you put, some distance between them, and you put other things, more people in the United States happen to be married. You don't quite get that training. But Brad, when you train those Marines in Okinawa, in your proximity, you're right there. There's a jungle right there. There's ranges nearby. But especially that amphibious reconnaissance piece, and the fact that your Marines were mainly single and living in the barracks, and they wanted it. There was nothing else for them that was more important to train. How is that for you as a commander, needing to develop and make sure the training is realistic, that it's safe, all those things?
So to me, there were several advantages. I think one was location. Obviously, you talked about the proximity, forward deployed on the water, streamlines a lot of the logistical and coordination issues because you're physically co-located right there. It makes things a lot easier. So being able to have that was a tremendous opportunity. I think the other part with that is being working with foreign militaries, being forward deployed. There is a huge emphasis on having the TSC, the Theater Security Cooperation Program, being able to do the bilats, the trilats, the multilateral events that are huge. Obviously some of the biggest things that we gain by that is having access, building relationships, having the engagements with the foreign military, where you're going out with the ROC, the First Special Reconnaissance Marines. You've got relationships with their officers, with their enlisted Marines. Being able to go out with the Singapore Naval Dive Unit, working with their personnel. I mean, I still get emails from a lot of these guys. The Australian Army, being able to do a tremendous amount of opportunities to work with them, and also the Thai Marines. I mean, there's a lot of relationships that have been built over years and years of engagements. The Philmars. So there's a lot of really neat things that are out there. But to me, the location and the foreign military engagement is one thing, but I think the cornerstone of this whole thing is mindset. It broadens your perspective on being able to have that opportunity where I think on the East and West Coast, unless you actually deploy, you're not going to have those, your ability to have those experiences, I think, are very much limited. So they're still out there, but I just don't think you have the ability to do a lot of those things.
And one thing for the listeners, I'm going to date, ourselves in time with this next comment is, so Brad and I were over in Okinawa at the same time. He came over as an infantry officer with the infantry battalion, and I was a force recon platoon commander on both of the times that he deployed over there. And I was actually recruiting and encouraging him to come over, and I know he wanted to do that, and he did. But once he finally arrived with his permanent change of station, this is the days before every platoon commander, every officer had a computer. I mean, now pretty much every Marine has their own personal computer, but back then you didn't have that was not available. The government didn't issue all that. So most of this was written down, and it took extensive notes, and I remember passing that on to Brad, and the importance of that is not just necessarily the means of writing it down or typing it in a document, but making sure that when you understand there's a succession. I know I was about ready to be, rotating off of Okinawa, and he was coming in, but in order to set him up for success, him going to these exercises requires contacts on the aviation side, both Marine and Air Force Special Operations, and connections with all these different militaries that I had been training with for 3 years, that he was about ready to take that torch. And whether you're in the military or in the corporate world, it's important to have that mindset of those, you're building people up underneath you. And that's what was the beauty in Force Recon, is we didn't have a competition amongst the platoon commanders. And in some organizations that can be very toxic, where there's some showmanship and they're always trying to outdo each other. But that was the beauty, is it was really, there's not a lot to do. So the very few platoon commanders that were there, most were deployed, but you're really trying to help them out. I really did enjoy that. Now, Brad, you were in Okinawa, and what was also very rare, because you went from one isolated place in 29 Palms, California, out near Death Valley. You go to Okinawa, Japan for 3 more years. And then from there, you had a very rare opportunity, which only one Marine officer is assigned for the ground component, but you did an exchange with the British Royal Marine Commandos. And as I stated, it's very rare. It's considered a high honor to be selected for that. And it starts with going through the British Royal Marines Commandos. They have their own particular commando course, much like the Army has their Ranger course, or now the Marine Raiders have our initial training course. But you went through that British Royal Marine Commando course, and what were some of the highlights that you recall going through that course, and some of the challenges for you?
So I was selected as the U.S. Marine Corps Royal Marine Exchange Officer. To me, what attracted to me was the history with it initially. You've got the organization. The Marine Corps was based off of it. They're 101 years older than the U.S. Marine Corps. So there's a lot of history and tradition that goes back with that. It was a fantastic opportunity. And also to get selected the exchange, and then also with the commando course. It was challenging, it was demanding, and it was a fantastic opportunity. And I would say, to me, the biggest thing that stood out was the Royal Marines' individual proficiency as commando skills and infantry are very, very good. And
I know you had mentioned to me during and after your time with the British Royal Marine Commandos, some of those experiences that they have in Europe, which are often different than we have in the United States. The U.S. Marines often are focused a great deal on amphibious operations, where in Europe you get to experience some of the cold weather. And can you talk a little bit about some of your memorable experiences with the British Royal Marines and some of the deployments you did with them?
So 2 things stand out. One is Scotland. I think the biggest thing is a lot of Royal Marines focus on the cold weather and mountain training. That's a key focus area. While I was there, we had the ability to do a unit deployment up to Scotland, up in the Scottish Highlands. During that time period, we were up there for over a month. We're doing a multitude of different climbs, but essentially it built up to the Ben Nevis, which is the highest mountain in the British Isles. So varying degrees of elevation and distance, but essentially just building up the endurance and your ability as a mountain leader to be able to prepare. So to me, it was a fantastic opportunity. I think it provided a lot of appreciation for Scotland. One of the other places that it was a big part of that was also Norway. So some of the areas that we went up to were up in northern Norway, and literally we were over 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle. During that time period, we focused a lot of skill sets on general mobility, being able to move around, trying to operate in the environmentals with a daily of minus 25 degrees. I think the coldest while we were there was like minus 56, which was a tad bit chilly. So basically taking that, not getting past the mobility, and how are we going to utilize that in combat and doing tactical skill sets and building up to force on force. I think one of the most memorable events that I had that was rather entertaining was we were doing a cold weather warfare course. So at the end of it, you're essentially navigating from point to point with all your kit and skiing. So you're staying with your group. The final link-up point was in a lake. So amazingly enough, the lake already had the cutout ready for us. So while we were there, we were able to do our ice breaking skills and basically swimming into the water and being able to physically pull ourselves out. So it was a great time. It was a good experience, and I enjoyed it.
One of the lessons I learned doing some training with the Brits, and the U.S. Marines have a British enlisted an officer assigned both on the East Coast and up at our Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in the Sierra Nevadas. And going through that course, our Marine Corps Mountain Warfare, the Mountain Leaders course, it's a great, very challenging outdoor heaven up there in California. But the Brit, he would always say, one of their leaders in the British Royal Marines, their mountain leaders are truly exceptional in their skills and their training, and the people that they send over are really top notch. But I remember, their color sergeant, which is like one of our senior enlisted, he'd always say a mountain leader is supposed to be uncomfortable, and that's an important point for those, whether you're in the military or you're in the corporate world. You need to get in your mind, if you're a leader, there's going to be loss. And that doesn't just occur for those in the military on the battlefield, but if you're operating in a business, whether it's your small business, you're in the corporate world, there's going to be somebody that doesn't show up for work. There's going to be somebody that gets a serious sickness. And, when you talk about being uncomfortable, a leader has to fill those gaps. He fills them with other people, has to shift and plug those gaps, or he has to fill in front lines from himself from time to time. And you have to get that in your mind. But the British, they often don't, it is fairly flat until they go up in Scotland. And, I've been up there where Brad was talking about, to Ben Nevis and these training areas in the Highlands. And one good point about that is, you need, like the British did, they'd operate in this, they're about kind of like their base there is a place called Kinloch Leven. And it's very important to, even for a short duration, to be in an area and environment that tests, your abilities, as an organization. Can you continue at this pace? What did you learn from it? A lot of organizations that continue on and, their sales don't change very much. They're, in a military sense, they don't really progress that much. And you look at, how often did they go to some place and truly challenge themselves? And what did they do afterwards to record that so that they improve themselves, and that's built in. That's a very important thing that leaders in any organization must understand. Is goes back to like that British Royal Marine Commando. A mountain leader is supposed to be uncomfortable. You have to test your organization, and then you have to record what those are, good and bad, and learn how to continually improve. What were the good things that you need to, continue to advance? People say sustain. That's ridiculous. A leader must advance in every direction. If it's a strength, you need to continue to develop that. If it's a deficiency, you need to really, make sure that doesn't happen again, especially if it's a critical area. But speaking of that, Brad, you were with the British Royal Marine Commando's incredibly rare, honor and opportunity. But then, it was like a Peter Pan moment. It only lasts so long. The good times all come to an end, and you had to make a decision. And once again, at this point, we knew each other. We were communicating back and forth, and you made the decision right as MARSOC was standing up, and I was telling you, come on over to MARSOC, but you say, hey, I want to get into the infantry. I want to go to deploy in Iraq. You talk about two things, if you'd answered what led you to go to the infantry, and then talk a little bit about that deployment that you made with the infantry as a company commander to Iraq.
So, timing and sequencing always have an important part to play in decisions. I think one of those things is that sometimes you need to make a decision when you don't have all the information. And that's essentially what led to this case. So I had already made a commitment that I wanted to go back to the infantry and take a rifle company to Iraq. I'd already given a commitment to do that at the time period. So I was moving out. So it was obviously different from the last several years that I had been on, and then going back to the infantry. Essentially coming back to the States was falling straight into a pre-deployment training cycle to go into Ramadi and Fallujah vicinity. It was very scripted. There was very little white space that was in there. Based upon everything we'd been through, it was a very standardized pre-deployment training cycle. And honestly, it wasn't anything more than the basics. So there were a number of training gaps, and you were always trying to find time to be able to provide additional skills or training that was required, that you knew that you were going to have to do. So, going into Iraq in 2006 and 2007, it was a strange time. It was very kinetic. Like I said, we were working out of Ramadi and Karma. The leadership at the time, from my perspective, was short-sighted with the pre-deployment training cycle, and also exploring or utilizing alternate methods for insertion and going after the enemy. IEDs were a big thing. They're still a big thing. They will continue to be a big issue. But, I think after a while, when you're seeing, 15, 16, 20 IED belts a row in a row, and seeing guys get hurt and injured, there's other ways to be able to get after it. And I think that was one of the biggest things that I tried to address and try to focus. But I still believe that to be true today.
So one of the other big changes, you'd served Force Recon as both an officer and as an enlisted Marine. You had this incredible experience with the British Royal Marine Commandos. What were some of the main differences or similarities between, now you're with the infantry, and there's a broad spectrum of U.S. Marine infantry, young to senior, but how was that compared to those previous, almost 6 years you served with the British Royal Marine Commandos and with Force Recon Marines?
So to me, the Royal Marines remind me of the Marine Corps. What I was, led to believe was like decades ago. Strong esprit de corps, amphibious focused. They would train hard. They'd have a good time. There was a lot of camaraderie. That was one thing that was very evident. I think those are very similar. as far as between the Marine Corps and the Royal Marines. I would say some of the differences, I think they lend themselves towards a primary MOS, which I think is hugely beneficial. I think is a good thing. As far as their mountain leaders, I mean, Fred, you talked before about them being, true experts, and they are. They are literally built, and that's what they are. They are the resident expertise at the company, the commando group level. They are the primary experts, whether it's mountain leaders or physical training instructors. That's one thing I think that we could benefit from, and hopefully that'll happen. And the other thing I would say is the safety restrictions. I think that there's a lot less amount of worry that is put into training restrictions over with the Brits versus with the U.S. I think we're overly concerned about operational risk, the ORM, the matrices. I think it's important, but I don't think it should be the end-all be-all for preventing training or dulling it down to where it's not effective.
You came back from that deployment. We'd been communicating for several years when you were over in England with the commandos. You were, doing your workup, and then through your deployment into Iraq with the 6th Marines. You and I were continuously communicating, and I was recruiting you again this time to come to MARSOC, and so you were able to quickly finish that tour, come over to MARSOC, and we were both working inside the operations section, and Brad was working in the current operations. I was working in training. This was a time right after our deployment in Iraq, and I was on a criminal investigation. But so I was in this penalty box up there, and Brad was a friendly face that I recognized. But the question, Brad, is there was a lot of people when MARSOC stood up that had very minimal experience in the infantry. Most had no experience at all in reconnaissance or force recon, and there was still a large percentage that had no experience in the Marine ground component whatsoever. These were people, various intelligence staff billets. And did you, one of the, there was a few of us who had that force reconnaissance background. Did you feel like you had to fight, above your weight class to get things done, that you saw, hey, this needs to get done? And we're both there in the operations section. How were your experiences during those early years at MARSOC?
I think upon my arrival at MARSOC, I think it was a bit of a shock. There was a tremendous amount of gaps in leadership, proficiency, and direction. I think they were pretty glaring from the beginning. One of the things that I noticed the most was the lack of combat experience within the field grade officers and many of the staff and COs. I knew that this was going to be more painful based upon that. But not only that is, before MARSOC was established, you had, the reconnaissance battalion and force reconnaissance companies. You had guys that already had raised their hands and had asked to be selected again. So I think one of the things to me was that there were some guys that came over and went over. I know that there was a tremendous amount of hesitancy based upon, there was opportunities for to go do that. And there was a lot of guys that just didn't. So it just seemed to me at the time there was opening the floodgates, and there was a lot of folks that were brought in that didn't have the background, didn't have this experience or the expertise to be in the positions that they were making decisions. So there was a significant gap in advanced proficiency skills, I think, throughout the command. And, I think the lack of these areas also led to a slow decision-making cycle on all manner of manning, training, and equipping the command. They had some good Marines, but they weren't being represented as well as they could have been.
So on that particular subject, Brad, there were some guys, as you said, they were raising their hands, and the command didn't, give them the invitation to come over. And there was also some with force reconnaissance experience that made it very intentional that they didn't want to become a part of the Marine Special Operations Command. So one of the things that happened is, I mean, you have to have in the Marine Corps Special Operations, MARSOC and now Raiders, you got guys going forward downrange, briefing. The higher command is the Special Operations Command down here in Tampa. You've got theater special operations. I mean, they were deploying. Our unit was deploying to Afghanistan, but you also had units deploying into Africa, into Central America, and they're briefing these theater special operations commanders. And you talk a little bit about some of these people and how that was received as these Marines who are supposed to be special operators, but they don't have any of the background or knowledge, and they're briefing senior enlisted officers who are SEALs or Green Berets. They're representing an organization that's just standing up, but they were from the Air Wing, or they were from a field other than, and they had no knowledge. How do you think that was received? That you saw it from some of those meetings that you went to these various higher headquarters or units that we would support?
So I would say it was represented poorly. I think one of the prime examples, I had the opportunity to deploy out with CJSOT of Afghanistan. Initially was out with 7th Special Forces Group, and then went out with 3rd Special Forces Group. I think during that time, there was a number of folks that had come through. And, it's I think one of the common verbiage or statements that were brought out, especially from the Special Forces community, is that a lot of guys said, hey, you guys are where we were at 50 years ago. And there was a lot of resistance when the Green Berets started. They had a big resistance within the Army and the separation of the command. I think when you open the aperture and have some various ground combat elements and some non-ground combat elements come over, and then all of a sudden they're magically turned into an expert. There's some glaring deficiencies, and it's fairly evident. And I think that was one of the things that was brought up numerous times to me through some of the experiences. And it's a maturing thing. It happens over time, and it's got to get there. But I know there was a lot of times during that piece that MARSOC was considered to be a JV team in the beginning, and there was I think a lot of it lends back to the development of the leadership was not there, and the expertise that was required that slowed a lot of decision making.
And right at that time, you and I had both been serving in the operations section at Marine Special Operations Command. They said, hey, Brad, you interested in going and taking one of these Marine Special Operations companies? And your decision was similar to mine. I wanted to get back to the reconnaissance community. There was men in that field, and this is just my opinion. That there were some real pure elements. Not that the guys in MARSOC weren't, but I definitely saw some of the leadership at the top was having a negative impact. So I chose to get back to Marine Reconnaissance, and Brad also, when he finished his tour at Marine Special Operations Command, went over to take command of 2nd Force Reconnaissance Company, which was right there in Camp Lejeune. And could you tell the listeners a little bit about your time and also what happened when MARSOC stood up? They took a lot of the manpower, not all of it, but a great majority of, especially the experience, and how that compared when you were previously serving with Force Recon.
So there was a solid core of experienced staff NCOs within the company. I think, let me backstep. So I was in Afghanistan. I was over with CJSOT, and I'd gotten an email followed up by a phone call that basically was asking for me to meet some of the command leadership, the CG at the time, to be able to discuss next opportunities or whatever. So we'd met and talked. And then basically the offer had been to be able to take a MSOC. During that same process and the other opportunities that it had provided themselves, that I had a opportunity to take over Second Force. They were wanting to stand it back up again, and I jumped at it. So, be it as may, I made a decision. I think hands down, I made the best decision, and I wouldn't change a thing. When I went over there initially to the company, there was a solid core of experienced staff NCOs with the company, and a lot of young and aggressive officers that had that drive to excel. And to me, that was exciting. I had missed that, and I was looking forward to that. We had the ability to develop a lot of major operational level requirements. Not only were just basically being able to establish a budget, refining the training pipeline, and actively recruiting the right sort to be able to come over for this type of work. By the time I left, we had 5 operational platoons that had a full capability as far as HAHO, free fall teams, combat dive insertion capable, and also with JTACs in every single platoon. And that wasn't the way when I showed up. So to me, I think the biggest thing was that while we were over there, and by the time I had left, there was no less than 50 staff NCOs or officers that had contacted me or a senior staff NCO within the company wanting to leave MARSOC to come back over. So to me, I knew we were doing things right, and I knew we were going in the right direction, and the word was out.
So it's much like when we stood up MARSOC, being the first company commander, I had to establish certain priorities. Like, these are what we're going to do. There was a lot of unknowns, but when you were re-standing up Second Force Reconnaissance Company, what were some of those priorities that obviously a lot of things had changed because a lot of personnel got sucked over into MARSOC, so you could focus on pretty much everything. But, what would you say were those top 3 things that you had to, take aim at those close targets?
So to me, it was pretty straightforward. The 3 top priorities were manning, training, and equipping. The first thing was to build with manning was building cohesive units of action, not just aligning 24 guys to a platoon, but aligning the right 24 guys with the personalities and capabilities to work together a cohesive unit. From there, the training piece, focusing on the individual skills, the team skills, and also the unit skills to be able to prepare them to deploy and to be able to chop over to the MEU. And the equipping, building and being able to man the table of equipment that supports the mission requirements. Those pretty much drove a lot of it. From there, we were able to really work on our deployment for training, our DFTs. We were able to support multiple DFTs per platoon off Camp Lejeune, which was one thing that was a major sell for us. Working on patrolling and communication, we would routinely go out to West Virginia to be able to do training out on the Appalachian Trail. Airborne sustainment training, we'd go out to Lewisburg on a regular basis of being able to hone those skills where we're being able to work up to 18, 19, 25,000 feet, depending upon the restrictions at the time. Some of the dive packages that we were able to provide, we were going out to the Dutch Antilles, being able to work with the Dutch Maritime Special Operations and also the Dutch Marines. Air fires and JTAC sustainment training, that was one thing that was very important to me. We were able to work a lot, sending guys down to Avon Park, working with some other units to be able to get as much checks and being able to have guys' proficiency. So taking all that into construct, the biggest thing I wanted to really to be able to build, I think one of the things that still goes on today is a certification exercise, is building a certification exercise before they chop. So basically what I was looking for was a deployable evolution for each platoon before chopping in the MEU. Based upon previous relationships, we're able to work with the Dutch and on a consistent basis, focusing on ground, amphibious, and dive capabilities.
Two of the things on that you mentioned, Brad, very important because when I left MARSOC, I went over back to Okinawa, Japan, and also, got back into reconnaissance. And as their operations officer, I saw that it's very critical because, you're sending these Marines out, to do combat operations in the southern Philippines, to go out on ships where anything could happen. And, we're also deploying as a battalion to do combat in Afghanistan. And it's critical, men's lives are at risk to have, like you said, a certification exercise, because that wasn't always the case prior to the war. Unless you're going out on the ships as part of the Marine Expeditionary Unit, there would be some type of training. Some folks, would have a pre-deployment exercise, to go to Okinawa, but that was not standardized across the Marine Corps. It was, but it was evaluated differently across the Marine Corps. The standards were different, and it was very important. You did it on the East Coast, and I did it on the East Coast of Okinawa, Japan. But, we really wanted to make sure that those tasks that the Marine Corps expected this unit to be capable of were truly, mission capable. They demonstrated mastery, they were evaluated, and they were ready to go if called to do so. And this was a time when people were, MEUs were being employed. They were getting flown into Afghanistan. They were being sent into combat, and it was very, very critical. And I will say also, to Brad, one of the things I think was a shortfall when I was at MARSOC, when we were both there in the operations section, I was in charge of training, and I had the British Royal Marine Commandos, their exchange officer and staff non-commissioned officer were assigned to Camp Pendleton or to Camp Lejeune, where we were stationed permanently, and they'd come and talk to me, and they'd want to get involved in training with MARSOC, and I was trying to set it up so much, and they just wanted to train at home station, which the Dutch Royal Marine Commandos are no slouches. And the one thing I would say to listeners is, you have to be sometimes very observant. My boss, these individuals who didn't have the reconnaissance background, they made the decision not to do any of this bilateral training. But Brad had mentioned he'd trained with the Dutch, and that was kind of a referral that they were able to show the agility and, hey, we're going to do this. And they went down the Caribbean, great place to do your amphibious, operations. And it's a great relationship that lasted for years and years. So some of the leadership things, two of them that I, want to reiterate these, points here is, again, goes back to what the British had said. You do have to be uncomfortable. You have to test your men to a point where you expect there to be shortfalls, failures, things that you're going to learn from. In order to grow, you have to identify where those areas, and you have to push yourself out of the comfort zone. Certification, that's where those come out, is when you do those extreme challenges. And the other thing is, look for those opportunities. Some people, they see some obstacles, that's going to be hard to plan. And what about this and this? And we'll have to get legal involved. When Brad went to Force Reconnaissance, they didn't have the super cool, sexy name like Marine Special Operations, but they immediately took advantage of this outstanding operation and years of relationships with the Dutch Royal Marine, the Netherlands Royal Marine Commandos. It was outstanding. And I was glad that somebody could work with our Dutch counterparts because they were great friends. So, Brad, when you were the commanding officer of the 2nd Force Reconnaissance Company, again, an elite unit of very senior and experienced Marines, you're serving a 3-star general. Actually, at that time, I think it transitioned, it was a 2-star general, but now it's returned to a 3-star general. And, you're a senior Marine officer, you're in charge of all those Marines and training them to support, as we'd mentioned when you were in Okinawa, but you're supporting now in Camp Lejeune, a general officer or a colonel that's going to employ those Marines overseas. What were some of the most memorable experiences that you had when you were the commanding officer of the 2nd Force Reconnaissance Company?
So we had many events that really stood out. I think one was really just being able to set up the operational platoons to support the Muse, being able to provide that standard battle rhythm. The other thing was sending platoon to Afghanistan to be able to deploy forward as well. We also represented in 3 international competitions. One was at Kasadik out of Jordan. The other 2 were tried to Corlez. Was based out of the working with the Dutch out of Curacao and Aruba. Took first place out of all 3 of those events. We also had the Second Force rededication ceremony that was conducted while I was there. We had the ROC repositioned back over to the headquarters. Not only had that, but also reestablished the Second Force Recon Association annual reunion up at Camp Lejeune. So basically maintaining the ties with the previous Marines that had been there and had basically established a relationship. Also the certification, getting the free fall jump masters and basically expanded them, taking because I think initially when we showed up we had a handful. By the time we left, we had I had more free fall jump masters than I knew what to do with. Not only that, but we're also able to certify guides and towards. So not only just certifying the vast number of free fall jump masters, we're also able to conduct high glide courses, which is a separate parachute canopy, which provides additional range and capability. Also in there, we're able to certify a number of select free fall jump masters to the towards equipment and towards passenger, which is basically a tandem off-site release, basically jumping a barrel, being able to fly in a bunch of equipment, and then after proficiency, you're able to fly passengers with you, basically do a tandem. As well as that, the amount of JTAC skills and capabilities of being able to build it up. By the time we left within the company, we had over 20 JTACs that were certified and proficient in their skills, which to me was a big deal. So those are the things but the biggest thing that I walked away with was that Marines were excited about their job, they were excited about going to work, and they were excited about being a Marine.
And you really did build that company back up to where it had been. You said you'd stepped in right when they were talking about forming it back up. But, he really did the max effort he could and develop those capabilities to where Second Force was prior to MARSOC standing up. Then, Brad, you had finished your time at the commanding officer's Second Force Reconnaissance Company, and you went to a year-long school, the Command and Staff College, and then you transitioned down here to Tampa, Florida for your first time in Tampa, and you kind of fell in love with it. But you were working at the Special Operations Command, the J3, which is a joint, because it's a joint command, has all the services represented there. But in the operations section of the 3, you had a unique role in their fires element. And as you had just got done explaining, and a lot of the listeners may not have a military background, and what you mentioned, the JTAC, that's a Joint Terminal Air Controller, or otherwise it's a man with either radio or data communication up to airplanes or to a rear area to request aircrafts be sortied, and then he's actually doing terminal control of talking to the pilot, transmitting data, telling him where to put warheads on foreheads that are right in front of him. And he made sure that when he was the commanding officer at Second Force Reconnaissance that they had that capability inside each platoon. And he knew how important that was because he had previously served as a mortar, an 81 millimeter mortar for, that's a battalion asset in the infantry battalion is a fires subject matter expert. So he had this knowledge of indirect fires, of aviation ordnance. And so when he came down here to Tampa, was promoted lieutenant colonel at that point in time, they moved him in, and then he got put into a leadership role while he was here in charge of the fires. And Brad, can you talk a little bit about those experiences, how important they were, and how important it was your particular background in fires was for you to be successful there?
So initially, when I came into the SOCOM and the J3 in the ground branch. So within there's several sections that are in there, but initially I went in with the fires and then moved over after deploying as the branch chief for the ground branch. There was a lot of quality personnel throughout the soft enterprise there, from all throughout the command. It was really provided a fantastic ability to see how a 4-star headquarters worked, and then the ability to serve with Admiral McRaven and also General Votel, and then watching their ability to be able to shape the command at the time. So in reference to the fires piece, a lot of it was focusing on gaining and maintaining proficiency. Each of the components within the command have their own unique limitations and capabilities on what they need to do, but basically it provided an opportunity to see all that and then see how we can best shape the command and help the organizations improve.
Yeah, and then when you were at Tampa, you got some good thoughts in your head about, I like it down here, but you transferred when it was your time. Normally infantry officers are, unless they're homesteaders, and if you're a homesteader out there, go ahead and turn the broadcast off, because honestly, you weren't pulling your weight. You were letting other people deploy while you're soaking up the sun in sunny Tampa. But shame on you. But anyway, you did every 3 years you were rotating, you're doing what the Marine Corps told you, which is what a good majority, but not all, more should. But then you went back to Camp Lejeune, and you went back straight into another workup. You were actually shotgunned out there because you didn't have a lot of time, to prepare. It was basically, like you're standing on the ramp of the plane about ready to jump off. So you immediately went overseas, and this time it was the Marine Corps signed up, for a special purpose, is what it's called, Marine Ground Air Task Force Crisis Response. So it kind of took over a role that I was doing as a fast company commanding officer. And, the exact same area. Our regional area was Europe and Africa. And we would forward deploy units to be ready to do any type of crisis in there, mainly reinforcing embassies or critical national assets. Is basically, immediate force of choice, immediately be able to respond. But your role was as the operations officer, and you deployed forward. And if you could talk a little bit about, that deployment, some of the exercises and places where you were going and how that was, because it was kind of a different role for the Marine Corps at that time. How was it?
So I basically left Tampa after deploying again, went back to Lejeune, and then straight into essentially right into deployment. Within 30 to 45 days, we were flying out and heading over to deploy. So it was a pretty quick turn as far as that. I fell in as the operations officer for Special Purpose MAGTF Crisis Response Africa. Throughout the entire time period, the organization was developed based upon a post-Benghazi scenario. So based upon that, the Marine Corps' contribution to that for focusing on North and West Africa was this element, which essentially is about an 1,800-man element with a vast array of aircraft, platforms, ground elements, and logistical capabilities to be able to support the mission requirements for the commander of U.S. AFRICOM. From there, we also conducted a number of bilateral events, 62 total throughout the 6-month period, to over 17 African countries. We also supported Joint Special Operations Task Force throughout our entire time for the deployment. So we spent a lot of time building relationships, working with, it's kind of a unique experience of being based in Europe, but focusing all your attention in Africa and being able to provide that capability. It was a unique experience. I think I was well prepared with a lot of the basis that I had as far as the air integration and a lot of the previous experiences built towards that. So to me, it was a great experience. That was my 10th deployment, so I was not hiding. So after having 10 deployments in the Marines, it was over 8 years overseas. It was quite a bit.
Why I mentioned that and why Brad reinforces. There's a lot of folks, Brad and myself, both have had 10 years or 10 deployments. And there's a lot of guys that will stay in the same location. It means the government's paying that housing for many of these folks for often 15 years at a certain place. They retire a career with a house paid by Uncle Sam, and they'll do half those number of deployments in a 20-year period, which is, again, shame on you. You're getting all the accolades from, thank you for your service, but it's who's really being served, who was the primary beneficiary. Thank you for serving as little as you did. I may be opinionated on that, but Brad's a good example of somebody that came in to serve, and then after that deployment, Brad, they wanted you to redeploy, and you were looking at that point in your career. They wanted to, you moved up to be the executive officer, which is a promotion in the seniority of a Marine regiment, and then the Marine Corps. They select individuals to be promoted for a command position, and they didn't have you selected for a battalion command. So the battalion or the regiment that you were with, they were scheduled to go, and they went over to Afghanistan, and so you were remained behind for the 6th Marine Regiment, the commanding officer for the regiment in the rear in Camp Lejeune until you deployed. But if you can talk a little bit about those thoughts in your head and the decisions that you had to make at this point, because now you've decided, okay, if the Marine Corps is not going to allow you to, command a battalion, you're going to look to do other things. And one of those is retire and move on to sunny pastures here in Tampa, Florida. But start to talk. The first thing is, what was that decision, that you made, and how do you have to weigh that with the importance of your family and your future? How you talk through that a little bit?
So once we returned back to CONUS from Africa, we snapped back into the regimental requirements. We focused on preparing. We had 5 infantry battalions at 6th Marine Regiment for the time. So supporting the MUs, the SP MAGTAFs, and then the 4 deployed battalions to Okinawa. During that time period, I got asked to go out again. So that would have been my 11th deployment to go back to Afghanistan. I had made up my mind at the time that after nearly 26 years, it was time for me to move out accordingly. So I went ahead and made the decision to transition. So based upon the mission requirements, the regimental commander at the time was directed to deploy as an individual augment. The division CG at the time was Major General Love. Had asked me to take command of 6th Marine Regiment until I retired and was ready to transition. It was a tremendous opportunity. Basically, having a regiment with over 4,000 Marines and sailors going out is not exactly the premier retirement job, but it was a fantastic opportunity without a doubt, and I wouldn't change anything about it.
Now, another thing, Brad, is when you were the commanding officer at your retirement for the 6th Marine Regiment, the CO had deployed forward. That is basically like your capstone for your entire career. What events did you do there, and how, as you reflect back, did any of those events have significant meaning for other events that you've done across your whole entire career that you spent 26 years almost serving your country?
So with 6th Marines specific, to me, obviously being a company commander there with deploying and then coming back and as the regimental OPSO, XO, and then with the culminating point of being the acting commanding officer for the regiment before retiring, to me it was a tremendous opportunity. Once we got back from CONUS, from coming back from the SP MAGTAF Africa, we snapped back into regimental requirements. We had 5 infantry battalions at the time, which was non-standard. We had more than usual. So with having 4,000 Marines and sailors running all over the place was great. Supporting the MUs, the SP MAGTAFs, and also the 4 deployed battalions. One of the things that we had the opportunity to do in 2015 was support the Bellawood ceremony for World War I. To me, it was a tremendous opportunity.
Can you talk a little bit about the significance of Bellawood?
So Bellawood, obviously, if you look back in your history, Bellawood was significant because the Marines were requested to go in there. Initially, the Army had gone in, but Bellawood was a key location. The town is called Chateau Thierry. My French is not that good. However, the area and the terrain, there's some fantastic books as far as Into the Wheat Fields that really talk about the day-to-day interaction of the leadership and the challenges of being able to fight hand-to-hand, being able to fight under gas mask for 30 days, of being able to do a lot of the challenges that basically set the reputation for the Marine Corps. So when the Germans were fighting the Marines during the time in World War I, they had earned the name Tuffenhunden, which is Devil Dog. And from that battle, that is what is very significant from it. So to me, it was very special. So in 2015, I had the opportunity to go over as a commander of troops, which was an absolute honor. But not only that, we had the opportunity to do bilateral events with the French Foreign Legion and also with the French Marines during that time period. So for me, there's 3 places that stand out without a doubt. One is Iwo Jima, which I've had the opportunity to go there twice, Okinawa, and absolutely Bellawood. They're mythical locations for most Marines.
And thank you very much again, Brad.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office, you are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at gocommandoshow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our 6. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go Commando.